Well, good evening, everyone. You know, it was just a few weeks ago that millions of Americans were intensely engaged in the Senate confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh. Did you believe Dr. Ford, or did you believe Judge Kavanaugh? And even if Judge Kavanaugh was innocent, did you think he should be appointed as a Supreme Court justice? Well, as we watched all the senators talk about this and discuss it and debate it and then finally vote on it, we noticed that their decisions, how they answered those questions, were almost 100% determined amongst party lines. And then, if Facebook and Twitter and the discussions that happen on the news networks it would seem that Americans were also split almost evenly on this. It seems like if you had leanings to the political left, you were against Kavanaugh being confirmed. If you had leanings to the political right, you were for him being confirmed. Now, how is it that thinking people can all look at the same data and arrive at radically different conclusions? Well, I'll give you the answer in one word: horizons. Now, horizons are how we interpret our world. Horizons are comprised of factors involving our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, religious, and philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, and the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. There's just no way around this. Horizons are like eyeglasses that we all wear, and they're tinted, and the lenses provide us with a somewhat distorted picture of our world. Again, no way around this. That's just the way it is, and that's the main reason why we can all look at the same data and come at different conclusions. Well, that happens with historians as well. All historians are wearing glasses. Dr. Crossan wears these glasses, are his horizons. I wear them. Dr. Swain wears them. And every last one of you in here wear those glasses as well. The problem is that most of us don't realize that we have these glasses on. And even if we do, we make very little effort to see that we can minimize the negative impact these glasses have on our decisions. It's these horizons rather than the data that often inform our decisions more than anything else. And this is going to impact how we study Jesus and what kind of conclusions at which we arrive. And it's not just studies about who Jesus was, historians in that area. It's also historians who deal in non-religious matters. For example, Professor Swain here is an expert in the late Roman Empire. Now, I would guess, we haven't talked about this, but I would guess that there are a lot of issues that historians in your discipline discuss, and there's no consensus. There's no consensus in anything about Jesus either, a lot of things about Jesus. So, and it's not just historians, it's also in science. Scientists debate over a lot of issues, such as in the universe in which we exist. Do we live in the only universe, or is our universe just one of many? What about the laws of nature? Are all the laws of nature defeasible, or are there a few laws that are indefeasible? And what about those who embrace a naturalistic evolutionary theory of amoeba to man and everything's just natural? How did human consciousness come about through naturalistic evolutionary processes? Even those who would say we're all here by naturalistic evolutionary processes, the whole thing, they disagree on how human consciousness evolved. And some, like Colin McGinn, who's an atheist philosopher of the mind who's taught at Oxford, he has said that the problem is insoluble. There is no answer. We can't come to an answer. It's too difficult. So even scientists, despite the use of scientific method, there's many issues that they're not going to have a consensus on. So with this in mind, I want to make three important considerations to remember when we're discussing Jesus in history. The first one is just coming out from what we just discussed, and that is, because of the horizons of historians, there will never be a consensus on who Jesus is or who he was. Because of the horizons of historians, there will never be a consensus on who Jesus was. The second consideration for us to look at is there are three kinds of Jesuses. The first kind of Jesus we can call the historical Jesus. Now that's the kind of Jesus that historians can pretty much verify through using their tools and apart from faith. It's only what we can prove with Jesus with a pretty good amount of certainty. The second Jesus is the Christ of faith. The Christ of faith, we might say, is the Christ we find in our Bibles, in our New Testament. It's the Christ who existed in the form, the role of God, who is the creator and sustainer of the universe, says Paul. It's the Jesus who came down and was born of a virgin, says Matthew and Luke. It's the Jesus who, according to the Gospels, performed divine miracles and exorcisms, and then was resurrected, and right now is at God's right hand. And from there he will come to judge the world someday. That's the Christ of faith. Now, of course, there's a lot of things about the Christ of faith that the historian will never be able to verify. For example, a historian could verify that Jesus died for, take the statement, Jesus died for our sins. Historian could verify the historical element of that he died, but historians don't have the tools to say whether his death atones for sins. There's just no way a historian can do that. So things such as Jesus is deity, that can't be part of the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus might be able to be Jesus claimed to be divinity, but the historical Jesus could never be he is divinity. Now, that's the Christ of faith. And then the third Jesus is the real Jesus. This is the Jesus who lived in Judea and Galilee. This is the actual the real person who walked and lived in that time and area. Now, the real Jesus and the Christ of faith could be the same person. It could be that Jesus looks at the Christ of faith, that they were to meet one another, and Jesus would say, yep, that sounds like looking in a mirror. But it may not be that way. It could be that Jesus looks at the Christ of faith and says, well, you got some things wrong there. No, I never said that. I never did that. Well, I did something like that. I really didn't feed 5,000. Where'd you get that from? I fed 50. And the only reason is because we prayed and a guy came along and he saw us and he donated some food. No, that story isn't. So it may or may not be the same as the Christ of faith. Now, what historians do, they take the historical Jesus and you see what you can verify the Christ of faith. Okay? But if you took the real Jesus and then the historical Jesus, again, the historical Jesus is not a real figure. It would look like you got a real Jesus, and then you have an emaciated stick figure who's missing some parts with the historical Jesus. All right? What historians are trying to do, where my interests lay, is when we look at the historical Jesus, how much of the Christ of faith can we verify? And is there anything about the Christ of faith that the real Jesus would look at and say, that's not true? So those are the three kinds of Jesuses. The third consideration for looking at history and Jesus, when we discuss this, is methods and results. Now, what historians do is they typically will survey the sources, whether we're talking, whatever the question is, we look at the sources to see what are the relevant sources and what they say about that. So we're going to look at the early literature. We're going to look at the New Testament literature. Most, if not all, was written in the first century. And then we're also going to look at the apostolic fathers who were, some of them were the successors of the apostles. And we're going to look at the Gnostic literature. We're going to look at some fragments that really may or may not fit into some of the other ancient literature. And we're going to see, well, how much of this is valuable and how valuable is it? How much of it may help us when it comes to the historical Jesus? We may look at some of it and say, okay, well, this may not tell us about the historical Jesus, but it will tell us what some Christians were thinking in this time. Even the skeptical New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman would say, if you want to know about the real Jesus, there's only one place to go, and that's the New Testament Gospels. He says this is not for theological reasons, it's for historical reasons, pure and simple. So we might look at what people believed. Maybe that's a person's interest in history, or how theology developed over time. My interest is, what can we prove about Jesus, the historical Jesus? What is that? All right, so we're looking at the sources. We're going to look at, we're going to bring in some criteria. How do we verify things about Jesus? We're going to bring in some criteria. These are called the criteria of authenticity. These are nothing magical. They are common sense principles. They're named different things by different scholars. Some of the criteria of authenticity are rejected by scholars, like one that was used years ago that hardly anyone uses today is called the criterion of double dissimilarity. No one uses that. But they will use a handful of criteria that have proved to be pretty common sense stuff and have yielded some good results. These are things like, well, if we're looking at some sources, we're going to value a source that was written by an eyewitness a little more. We're going to give it a little more weight than we would a source that's not written by an eyewitness. It's common sense, right? If we're looking at a source that's written close to the events it purports to describe, that's going to have a little more weight to it than one that was written 100, 200, 300 years later. If a source reports some things that are kind of embarrassing details, embarrassing to the author or the movement that author is writing for, it has a better chance of being true, perhaps, because why would you make up something that's going to embarrass or discredit you? Or if there are multiple independent sources that are reporting the same event, if they can be shown to be independent and they're reporting the same thing, it's more likely to be reporting a true event, especially if one of those sources are an unsympathetic source versus a sympathetic source, right? So these are just, again, common sense principles. There's nothing magic about them. By using those, historians are able to construct a historical Jesus. Now, some of the results of that would be Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Jesus came on the scene. He believed that he had a special relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he taught in parables, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, and that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, crucified him either in April of the year 30 or April of 33, and Jesus died as a result. Virtually 100% of historians of Jesus grant these as facts using these criteria. They say these things actually happen about Jesus, whether they're atheist, moderate, liberal, conservative Christians, Jewish scholars, they agree on these things. And then historians of Jesus will typically, there are other things that they claim are pretty certain about Jesus, but there may not be a universal consensus on those. Let me just say one thing. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there is a movement among some New Testament scholars to move away from the criteria of authenticity, saying they really don't have that much value. Some even suggesting that we jettison the criteria altogether. I think these scholars, though well-meaning, are seriously misguided. There are a number of reasons why they go with this, but one of the main reasons, is that the criteria have not led to the desired consensus. But I think that such an expectation was flawed and misguided from its very beginning. Again, historians, there's never going to be a consensus on Jesus because of the disparity of horizons. You don't have a consensus among historians, even amongst a lot of non-religious things like ancient, late Roman Empire. You don't have a lot of consensus on many things within science. So we shouldn't expect a consensus when it comes to Jesus. There are other reasons as well, but I don't have a lot of time to discuss them. What I would say is to those who say we should abandon the criteria, that if we do that, do you believe that Jesus died by crucifixion? And if so, how do you get there without the criteria? So, in wrapping this up, I would say that we have to remember there's never going to be a consensus on Jesus. Remember that those are those three types of Jesus: the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and the real Jesus. And the third, we look at the methods and results. There are certain things that can be known about Jesus apart from faith and just using the tools of historians. Dr. Crossan and I, we've done historical work. I've done a lot of work, especially on the resurrection. He's done a lot of work. He's written a thick book called The Historical Jesus, other books on this. So we are interested in historical matters. We have radically different pictures of who Jesus really was. And so I'm looking forward to this evening's dialogue as we go through these, and you'll see the differences that we have and our different approaches to those, and where the differences come in, why those differences may exist. Thanks.
So a word about myself, if you will, and my presuppositions. This name, John Dominic Crossan, always sounds so pretentious to me. Why do you need 3 names? Well, the reason is important for tonight as well. When I was 16 years of age, I entered a Roman Catholic 13th century monastery. And when you do that, like in the Bible, when you get a new vocation, they wipe out your past, give you only a future. So I went in as John Crossan. That's still what's on my passport, driving license, and what the TSA people know me by. I became Brother Dominic. 19 years later, having realized that celibacy is vastly overrated, I decided to leave the monastery and the priesthood, but I was taking it all, with that exception, with me. So I put Dominic in the middle. It has no legal standing whatsoever. My government knows me as John. My God knows me as Dominic. At the moment, they're not on speaking terms, so there's no confusion. Out of that monastery, I took years of studying Thomas Aquinas. And it formed my mind as an intensely dialectical mind, for better or for worse. Here's what I mean by a dialectic. Take a coin out of your pocket. Try and look at the 2 sides at the same time. You can't do it without mirrors and stuff. We're not good at dialectic. Dialectic is any 2 things that can be distinguished but not separated without getting a mess. Yeah, I suppose you can cut a coin in 2 and see what you get. So I learned from Thomas Aquinas to watch out for reason and revelation. Aquinas could spend, as it were, the morning reading Aristotle and the afternoon reading the Bible and have no problems with supper. So reason and revelation are, for me, a dialectic. Distinguishable, of course. Separable, no, without destroying both. Now, I really mean that. You can't say, well, yeah, let's, of course, reason, of course. But, so whenever those get separated, by the way, when they really get separated, very often people get killed. I found out throughout history. So I'm very, very, very careful about separating them. That is simply the same with faith and history. As Mike said, of course, people can disagree on facts. There are even people who argue, scholars, who argue Jesus never existed. I think the major consensus is that's wrong, but it's there. So we have to get facts with some agreement, but then we get interpretations. Every incident involves a fact with all the arguments about that, and an interpretation with all the arguments about that. They are a dialectic, and we ain't good at deciding where is the fact and where is the interpretation. My interpretation is a fact. Your interpretation is a myth. Okay, so watch for dialectic. If anyone cares to understand me, that is, as far as I can understand myself, a profound realization. Reason and revelation. I got it from years studying Thomas Aquinas. I took it from the monastery with my name, as it were. Faith, they will not disagree, faith and history, unless we get either or both of them wrong, because they both come from God. Thomas was absolutely certain of that. He was never scared with arguments from reason. Let me look at another distinction. The distinction between the metaphorical and the literal. Don't confuse them between the metaphorical and the real. That's a fatal mistake made after it's the dark side of the Enlightenment. It's the endarkenment that is the other side of the Enlightenment, the loss of metaphor. Metaphor creates reality if you start living by it. Bad metaphor, bad result. Good metaphor, good results. Now, for example, before Jesus ever existed, and had he never existed, there was a human being in the Mediterranean world of the first century and the preceding one, whose titles were Lord, Son of God, God incarnate, Savior of the world, even Redeemer from sin, and of course I'm talking about Caesar the Augustus. And when you hear Caesar the Augustus, think of Jesus the Christ. Augustus is not his family name. It's his title, the one to be worshipped, from Sebomai. Now, is that metaphorical or literal? Did Augustus get up in the morning and say, God wants breakfast? On the other hand, it would be very unwise to say, you do understand, Your Imperial Highness, you're just a metaphor. I wouldn't do that. Because it's real, in that mysterious way that you would never say, it's just a metaphor. Because it's creating the reality of the Roman world. I always think that child born of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra called Caesarion, Little Caesar, when the stranglers ordered by Augustus approached him at the age of 17 to execute him, did he say, I'm just a metaphor? Metaphor creates reality. And if you can say that's just a metaphor, you've lost the game before you begin. So, those are the dialectical forms that form my mind. They are, to use Mike's, these are the glasses of my mind. So when I turn to Jesus, as a historian first, I know, but didn't somebody say when Jesus started talking, or say to Paul, but Paul, we've got a Lord, Son of God, Savior of the world. What do we want another one for? Or is that the profound revolution that was Jesus and Christianity? That the Romans would have said, our program is peace, of course, the Pax Romana, peace through victory. That's how we get peace. That is our great metaphor, and look, it's creating the reality of a successful empire. And Jesus, coming out of the Jewish tradition, would have said, you get peace through justice. All you get from victory is lull. Something like the eye of the hurricane that maybe makes you think everything is fine before the second wall arrives. So I want to ask, always, when I hear anything about Jesus, I can ask if you want, is it metaphorical or literal? You can ask, do I think they made that distinction? Do I think I'm making that distinction? But be very clear, if I ever say something is metaphorical, I mean it is far more important and powerful than the literal. The literal, no matter how important it is never more important than the metaphorical. That'll do me.
So we've all agreed that the next 40 to 50 minutes or so are going to cover about 4 questions. That's going to be not simply not enough. We're all going to leave here wanting more, but that's going to be inevitable in some way, because the fact that you're here on a Wednesday night instead of binging your Netflix means that you're seekers of knowledge, and so inevitably you're going to be unsatisfied. But we're going to cover some ground to some extent. But before we get to those 4 questions, I want to pose a preliminary inquiry to our speakers. And I'll start with you, Dr. Licona. Could you, just to establish some kind of common ground, and again on our ethic of good faith and mutual respect. Could you establish a few points that you agree with, Dr. Crossan? Maybe a few points that you think are worth further consideration.
Yeah, I think primarily I would say the idea of metaphor being powerful, it being important, I completely agree there. I also agree that metaphor can, in some sense, be more important than literal, depending on what we're talking about. I think it can, I mean, you can just state the dry, cold, hard facts of literalness, and those are important, but if you look at the metaphor and what the meaning is behind those, that can be moving and even more important. You know, we're both historians. We both have spent time looking at historical Jesus and trying to determine things. Did Jesus do these things? You've gone further than that, and I applaud that. You get into, well, what does this mean? How do we apply this in our lives? And I see that first you have the question that the historian asks, did it occur? And then you go further than that and you say, okay, but what does this mean? That's theology. And then, almost like the pastoral, how does this apply in my life? What are the practical implications for that? So it's kind of like you're wearing three hats, historian, theologian, and pastor in this. So, you know, I can appreciate that. And I love the spirit in which you give things to.
Let me just follow on that. But for me, even as a historian, if all you've got to say is, here's what Jesus said, I think it's bad history, because you have to at least say, and he's making a claim on the human race. And I think it's absurd, you know. But if somebody makes a claim, like Jesus definitely is making a claim. He's not just a nice guy, pats little babies, tells little stories. He is making a claim on the human race, on the meaning of life on earth, as it were. So if I'm, as a historian, reporting him, I have to at least say that. And then, of course, it'll get me to why the Romans are going to get executed, because they're in charge of making. So I think it's very bad history. I think we'd agree on this. It's a very bad history to make it seem as if Jesus was, I don't know if I might be insulting somebody to say he's a philosopher, because the Romans didn't crucify philosophers. He was making a claim on the meaning of life. So even as a historian, I must report that. Then, as a Christian, I say, and I think he got it right. That's me as a Christian. But, you know, if I was dealing with a historian who was, say, a committed atheist or something, we should be able to agree, yeah, no, Jesus didn't just say, be nice to one another. He didn't even just say, love one another. He said, love one another and don't be like the Romans. So, I mean, I think that's a powerful basis that mustn't be lost in any debates between us.
How about some points in Dr. Licona's opening statements that you can stand by?
I would agree profoundly with there have to be criteria. I don't know. I don't understand it if somebody says, well, it becomes like a Rorschach. It's just what do you feel about it. There have to be criteria. And I think we would be using exactly the same criteria ourselves and in using it. So there are criteria. The distinction between Jesus, you could say Jesus and the Christ, in the same way that you could say Augustus is his, Caesar is his name. Augustus is his more than title. So I want to be careful, though. I don't want Jesus to go off one way and Christ go off the other way. I want one person in there. But I would almost say crudely, Jesus is a fact, Christ is an interpretation. Or Jesus is history, Christ is theology. But Jesus himself is talking theology. So I don't know how to do history with Jesus and avoid theology. I do know how I could deny his theology, or affirm his theology, or live it. But I wouldn't know how to do a good historical explanation of Jesus if I let him drift totally away from it.
Good. Thank you both. Question one. Dr. Licona, we'll start with you. Do the Gospels contain eyewitness testimony?
Oh, I would say yes. And I'd say yes, definitely. I would especially say that would be the case with Mark and John. Mark, let's go with Mark here, because almost everyone agrees that's the first gospel to have been written. So we've got Papias, a guy named Papias, and both Irenaeus and Eusebius say that Papias was affiliated with one of the apostles, whether it was John, the son of Zebedee, or a minor disciple named John the Elder, of course, is disputed. But he was affiliated with one of Jesus' disciples. In fact, in his Chronicon, you have Eusebius putting Papias, Polycarp, Clement, Clement, with the Apostle John right after the 219th Olympiad and right before the 220th Olympiad. And the 220th Olympiad was the year 101. So he says Nerva he served for a year and a few months, and then he died. And then I think it was Trajan that took over, and he served, I think it was for 19 years. And it was during Nerva's time that John, the son of Zebedee, was released from exile. And then he says that his successors, the apostolic successors, or John's disciples would have been like Papias and Polycarp, and you name some of these folks. So Eusebius seems to be putting Papias before the year 101. Now, whether Papias wrote his interpretations of his 5 volumes of the interpretations of Jesus' discourses, we don't know. It could have been a couple decades later. But he would have gotten his information from this disciple of Jesus during the first century. And Papias says that Papias said that this disciple of Jesus, told him that Mark got his information from Peter. And he wrote down what he remembered Peter saying. So here we've got this guy, Papias, who heard directly from one of Jesus' disciples that Mark was writing down what he heard directly from Peter. That's pretty remarkable. And then the majority of scholars today, Johannine specialists, do agree that John, even though they don't think it was John the son of Zebedee, there are a few of us who do, but even though they don't think it was John the son of Zebedee, they do think that the author of John's gospel was either one of Jesus' minor disciples, or that the author used one of Jesus' disciples, perhaps John the son of Zebedee, or a minor disciple, as one of their primary sources behind that gospel. So yeah, we've got some good evidence that there's some eyewitness testimony in the Gospels.
All right, I'll start with a no, and I'll qualify it. First of all, we say the 4 Gospels, and I say it too. There's only one Gospel, the Gospel according to. That's profound for me. It's not the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. It's the Gospel according to. There's only one Gospel, which is Jesus. 4 versions. I think Paul would say mine too, so 5 versions. Okay. 5 versions. Gospel is not a fact, it's an interpretation. Good news. If to take your example before, I said, good news, Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court. Fair enough. I have a fact, he is, and I have an interpretation. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but somebody else could say, bad news, he's on it. Those are the 2 interpretations of a fact. So gospel is an interpretation. Now, if I looked at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from scratch and knew nothing about it, my first wouldn't be, these must be 4 eyewitnesses trying to tell, what happened. And look, they come up kind of pretty much with the same general structure. So yeah, these must be 4 eyewitnesses. But then when I actually study it, and now as an heir of 100 years of study, I find out, no, Mark is copied by Matthew and Luke. But I thought Matthew was supposed to be the one who was there. And he has no trouble changing Mark with a certain consistency, not just at random. Ditto from Luke. So if I put them in parallel columns and read them that way, I have to face this. Now, I don't think that's any way to write the gospel. I think there should be only one version in there. But Tatian and Martian in the 2nd century thought that too. They should be all collapsed into one, or get rid of them all and keep only one. He wanted Luke. So it is a weird thing that we only have one Jesus, but have 4 interpretations of Jesus, all of which are good news. So I'm kind of stuck with that. I don't think it's any way to write a gospel, to be honest with you. Certainly not the way I would have done.
It's problematic, though, to the question of whether there is eyewitness testimony in the gospel.
Yes, let me get to that then. So, what you were describing there, by the way, in a court of law is called hearsay, not eyewitness. But my problem is, I'm sure there's eyewitness.
Of course, that could be said about any author. That could be said about Plutarch. It could be said about Suetonius.
Well, if they're claiming, like, for example, Jesus said in Mark, okay, Mark is the first one. So let's say he's got it right. Let's say he was an eyewitness. How dare Matthew and Luke change it?
Well, why? When we look at the
Because they don't think it's eyewitness, they think it's gospel. And
no,
Matthew's willing to say, who are you, Mark? This is my you.
I would guess that you're probably like most, and I might even agree with it, that the titles, the gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, etc., weren't in the originals. So what we have here are 4 biographies of Jesus, and the question is, even if Matthew is using Mark, which he most certainly is, in my opinion as well, the compositional textbooks written by Theon and Hermogenes and Aphonius and Quintilian, they all say you should change things, you should paraphrase. And we see this as exactly what the gospel authors are doing.
Unfortunately, in this case, the compilers of the New Testament had the bad taste to keep Mark in there so we can see them at work. I can see Matthew change them.
But we can see Plutarch change Plutarch. Who changes Plutarch? He's doing exactly what he should have done as a good literary biographer and historian.
Yes, but he's not making anything like the claims about his antagonist, protagonist, whoever it is, let's say Alexander, anything like they're making about Jesus.
But why is that relevant? They're still following the same rules. And again, the question we're trying to discuss here is, do the Gospels contain eyewitness testimony? And even if Matthew did change some things, that doesn't mean that, or John or whoever, it doesn't mean they're not that their Gospels do not contain eyewitness testimony.
Well, contain becomes then almost a weasel word for me. There has to be somebody in there. But there is no way, when I read the crucifixion, for example, and like you, I'm historically as sure as anything is that Jesus was crucified. When I read, for example, let's say the last words, I have no way of telling whether an eyewitness there heard Jesus actually say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Or any of the others you want to use.
Right, okay.
And everything, when I read them, tells me it looks like the authors of the gospel made up these as the appropriate last word from their Jesus in their gospel.
Okay.
So I can see why Luke would say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what to do. And John would certainly not say, my God, no way is he going to say that from Mark. So I don't see these as eyewitnesses.
But then the question changes then from, what you're saying there, that could answer the question, are the Gospels, everything in the Gospels, every detail, the result of eyewitness testimony? Every single detail, the result of eyewitness testimony? I don't think that's the question, though.
Oh, I would not be arguing that, of course.
Right.
Or arguing against
but the question is,
I'm saying is you can't tell which is and which isn't. That's what I'm saying.
Sometimes, yeah, I would agree with you. Sometimes, maybe like the words of the cross, we may not be able to verify. There's a lot of things in the Gospels and in Plutarch, Suetonius, Sallust, Cicero, all these that we can't verify. I agree with that. But again, that's a different question than do the Gospels contain eyewitness testimony?
I would say every gospel writer wants to make a witness. Eyewitness is the least of their concerns.
Oh, I disagree.
But they want to make a witness, a martyrium. Yeah.
Well, what do you do with John's multiple statements that say, hey, and this disciple is saying these things, and we know that what he is saying is true, or Luke saying that these were passed along down to us from the eyewitnesses and the servants of the word. It seems like, at least for Luke and John, it's very important about the eyewitness testimony.
But Luke says eyewitness who became ministers of the word. I am absolutely certain there has to be eyewitness in there. But I have no idea how you could possibly, as a historian, know which is which, since the authors themselves were saying it is the meaning of this that's important. And I have no compunction, I the author, about saying Jesus said this if it makes the gospel clearer.
Say that again, please.
How would I put this? If Jesus is dying on the cross, I'm trying to imagine the mind of Luke, and I want to say, what's the most important thing I want him to say as he goes? I'm going to make up, Luke, I'm going to make up, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's what I want. Now, if I only had Luke, I don't know how I could doubt that. Why would I doubt that? Somebody must have been there, one of the women, and heard Jesus say that, and it was beautiful. So I only know that when I start comparing the four and try and understand what they're up to, really. That they're after gospel. And if there are eyewitness accounts, which there must surely be, they are so irrelevant for them that there's no way as a historian I can say absolutely for sure that's eyewitness.
I'm with you on that. Yeah. For most of what you said, almost all of it, I'm with you on that. We can't verify everything historically in the Gospels. Sometimes it's difficult to know if that's based on eyewitness testimony or all that stuff. I agree with that.
But then crucifixion, for example, I get from Josephus and Tacitus as well, and that is very basic for me because he's crucified and his followers aren't rounded up, which tells me he's crucified from the Roman point of view for non-violent resistance. Violent resistance, you crucify them all.
10 minutes. That's a miracle. Okay. Question two.
We got one.
We'll start with Dr. Crossan. Who did Jesus think he was?
Okay. Honestly, I kind of tend to cringe when I hear the question. I do. Because it was the great question of the 19th century, his self-consciousness. And I don't have a clue I don't know my own self-consciousness. And even if I told you, I don't see why you should believe that any more than what I write. I kind of know what I'm doing. I kind of try and see where I got it. I know what my interest in. My self-consciousness, that's for other people to tell me. What I see clearly about Jesus, and this is the massive consensus of scholarship, Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God, and I would argue he claimed that the kingdom of God is not coming soon, like John the Baptist, but is already present if and when you take it upon you, you people, and enter it, you people, like me, because you can't have a kingdom of one. So I'm convinced that that is really what Jesus was about. And if you said, are you the Messiah, Jesus? He would probably have said, that's a nice way of avoiding what I've just said. Are you going to enter the kingdom of God? Yes or no? But I'd like to know, Jesus, are you the Messiah? I think Jesus absolutely avoided that. Because as far as I can tell as a historian, the consensus in the first century of who the Messiah was would be a transcendentally endowed military leader, somewhat like David. That's taken from John Collins, not me. So what Jesus was kind of counter to the consensus idea of what a Messiah was among the ordinary people he's talking to. I'm not talking about what you could get from the Old Testament. So I think he's proclaiming the kingdom of God, and he's not that interested in himself. He's much more interested in the message, the vision, and in your participation in it. So I don't think he tells us. I have no problem, by the way, with somebody listening to Jesus and saying, I think he's the Messiah. And I have no problem with somebody looking at a coin and saying, you know, I think he's the Son of God. That's my type of Son of God, not this jerk here in this coin. So any title you want to give to Jesus, I cannot prove he ever used them, but I have no problem as a historian in that matrix from giving him the highest titles possible, way beyond prophet or Messiah, even the Son of God. It's on all the coins.
I would look at, of course, I'm going to part with Dominic here. I think, and it is kind of difficult because we're looking at what did Jesus say publicly versus with his apostles in private. And what did he say explicitly versus implicitly, and then what he did and how people interpreted him. So when I look at the, I think Dominic's correct about the coins. All right, so Caesar was called the Son of God. He was called the Savior of the world. In fact, there were kings back then. They were called King of Kings and Lord of Lords before Jesus. So these aren't titles that were just unique to Jesus. Okay. However, did they really think that they were gods? Well, I think we got some evidence that Gaius Caligula and Nero did. I don't know if the others did really think that they were God when the Senate conferred divine honors on them. I mean, how can senators who are mere humans confer divinity on someone when they're human? Humans can't confer divinity. So how much they really believed that they were divine is one thing. When we come to Jesus, if all we had were the virgin birth accounts in Matthew and Luke, then I'd kind of go with that and say, maybe this is what the Christians meant. But we got much more than that. You've got Paul, who says that Jesus, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, he's the creator of the universe. You have it in Colossians 1:16 and 17, it says he's the creator and sustainer of the universe. You have Paul in Philippians 2 that says Jesus existed in the role of God prior to his incarnation. And then he comes down, okay, and then Jesus he's known as a powerful miracle worker. Whether you want to attribute those miracles to psychosomatic things, he was still, virtually every scholar who studies this stuff acknowledges that Jesus performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. So it seems like Paul is out there saying in pretty clear terms that Jesus is the creator, sustainer of the universe. He existed in the role of God. Now, we can tell that Jesus, or Paul, we can verify that he's preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. He went up to them in Galatians 2, ran it by them, got it confirmed by them. So if Paul's preaching these things, his basic gospel message, certainly that would have had to include something as basic as who Jesus was, his identity. And it seems like this is what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. So we got to ask him, where do these pious monotheistic Jews get the idea that Jesus is God? And I can't think of any other plausible reason than that Jesus himself made claims to this effect. And so then when we come to the Gospels, we say, do they give us any signs of this? And you come to Mark, the first Gospel. It's biography. It's there to illuminate who Jesus is through his deeds. What are his deeds? Well, it opens up, as Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. It's not Jesus preparing the way of God, it's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. Mark chapter 2, he heals a paralytic and forgives him his sins. The Jewish leaders say it's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Chapter 3, they say his exorcisms is Satan casting out Satan. And Jesus says, no, it's me binding the strong man Satan and plundering his kingdom from souls. Chapter 4, he calms the wind. The Old Testament says something God does. Chapter 5, he raises the dead. Something the Old Testament says only God does. Chapter 6, he walks on the water. Something the Old Testament says only God does. The whole Gospel of Mark is painting this portrait of Jesus as God through his deeds. So this is what the earliest Christians are saying. This is based on the eyewitness testimony of what Mark gets from Peter of what happened. So yeah, I think whether he said things implicitly or explicitly or through his words or his deeds or both, I think he claimed to be more than Messiah. He claimed to be God. He claimed to be God's uniquely divine Son. And that's quite different than the Senate saying Caesar is the Son of God.
I would accept totally as the best way anyone ever says it in the New Testament, even Patrick Paul, what John says in the prologue, that the Logos was with God from all eternity, and the Logos became incarnate in Jesus. I think it might cause confusion to say Jesus was there from all eternity as if he was poised in heaven waiting for 4 BCE. I think basically, good translation of the Logos will be the dream of God. I think that was there from all eternity. It becomes incarnate in Jesus. But I take more seriously than you would that Caesar is God, because I think it is the metaphor that creates the Roman Empire. And when they said Jesus is God, it's a shorthand. If you know what that means, I have no problem saying it, by the way. But if you take it literally, then you mean God died at 3 p.m. on a Saturday or something, and the world ran on fine for a while? No. If you walked into my office and looked at a picture and said, "Is that Sarah?" I wouldn't say, no, that's just an image of Sarah. I would say, of course, that's Sarah. Jesus is the image of God for Christians. For Christians. He is. He's the way I see God in sandals.
Well, what do you do with Paul in 1 Corinthians 8:6 when it says, "One Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him"? He's talking about Jesus as the creator of the universe. It's not the Logos that becomes put in Jesus, almost like a Gnostic view. It is. He's the creator of the universe, according to Paul.
I have no problem with that, because Jesus, for me, is the one who took on the Roman Empire with non-violent resistance and said that non-violent resistance is the nature of God. Yes, non-violent resistance is God's way of being. So I have no problem with that, if you know what you're doing.
That's still different than saying he's the creator of the universe.
It's not, because I think the only thing that creates the universe and keeps it going is nonviolence. Violence is going to destroy it.
Well, that's just means to keep from destroying the earth. But when you say that he's the creator of the universe and all things came into being through him, that is saying that Jesus existed prior to being incarnated.
No, not really. And
how can you say that?
Because, okay.
How could it be more clear?
All right, let me put it. Before Jesus existed, for example, Romans had two ideas of divinity and humanity. The gods could come down from wherever they were and put on human lineaments and act like a human being. Now, they certainly weren't human. They were like you and I in Halloween, Gareth. On the other hand, they knew a human being who could descend among the gods because he had done something extraordinary for the human race. Mm-hmm. Let's call that the descending model and the ascending model. There were Christians who ended up being condemned as unorthodox by saying, in effect, Jesus had kind of come down from heaven. He'd been poised there for all eternity, I suppose, and you're on stage, just like the curtains were drawn back, here he comes. That's the descending model, taken right over from good old Greco-Roman paganism.
But the Caesars, there wasn't a descending model there.
No.
They were made gods.
They were ascending. Well, let's be a little bit more careful. Caesar was the son of his wife and his mother and Apollo. Yeah, and they were taken up among the gods. Right. Now, not just the Senate. It wasn't just the Senate. They came along later. He was already son of God with Julius Caesar, as you know, adopted son, and he was also born of Apollo. So his credentials were about as divine as you can get. The Senate did.
Okay, but he still wouldn't have been pre-existent. He would have come through divine paternity through Atia, just as Jesus, in that sense, would have come from divine paternity through Mary. But it goes beyond the virgin birth with Jesus because he's actually the creator of the universe. And that is radically different than Caesar.
Of course it is. That's why I'm a Christian, not a Roman. Honestly. I mean, seriously. I mean, you look at the same statements, and when Son of God is said of Caesar and Son of God is said of... No, they're not saying the same thing. But if you go back into the first century and say, okay, now, I'm a good, open-minded Roman, Paul, and you say Jesus is the Son of God, okay? I have nothing against that. Human beings can become sons of God. I know that. Tell me what your God, your Son of God, or your Lord, or anything, has ever done anything for me. I see what Caesar has done because he's making the Roman Empire looking pretty good, you know. He's up there in heaven among the gods, taking care of all family business. Now tell me what your God. I have no problem with humans becoming incarnate. He's up in heaven, fair enough. I haven't had an enlightenment, so I'm all for that. Tell me what your God is doing for me. That's a first century, a second century question, and Paul would have loved to have an open-minded Roman ask that question, because he knows exactly how to answer it. He would ask him, is Caesar really helping you? Every time you look over the Palatine Hill, what does it do for you? And he would argue what And he'd use all of that language. And yes, you're quite right. He would say the Jesus vision, as it were, the meaning of Jesus is there from all eternity. So would I.
Well, I would, but I noticed we've run out of time, so I want to respect that.
Sorry, but I go over, I'm sorry.
Good. So, question 3. Dr. Licona, can historians investigate miracles?
Absolutely. That doesn't mean they can confirm them. I think they can confirm the event, they just can't confirm the cause of the event. So let's just say that astronomers have been looking at a comet and tracking it for 10 years, and they've determined that it's on a direct collision course with our moon, and they say it's going to happen on a certain day at a certain time. And at that day, the Hubble Space Telescope is positioned in order to see what's going on. It zeroes in on the lunar surface, and we're all watching on our televisions, and at the right moment, bam, it slams into the moon's surface, and all this dust comes up, and as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it's in Greek and in Hebrew, and it says, Jesus is Lord. Now, a scientist can look at that and say, yep, the event happened. Yep. As far as we know, there is no natural cause for this. We have no idea how this message got written on the lunar surface. Does it have theistic implications? Absolutely. Could a scientist confirm that God made that happen? No. But a scientist could confirm that the event happened. Mm-hmm. In the same way, a historian could look at the evidence and say, come to the conclusion and say, yep, Jesus rose bodily, physically from the dead. But that would take a miracle. That would take probably God to do that, or a supernatural cause of some sort. As a historian, I can't verify that God did it or a supernatural cause did it, but I could verify the event and leave the cause undetermined.
Yeah, I agree. Let me push it a little bit. Everything so far, I agree with you. Let me talk about healings for a moment. My experience with healings is that I've been a chaplain with pilgrimages going to Fatima and Lourdes. I only did it once, and it was in 1960, so I was very young at the time, but I was a priest, I was a chaplain. I watched the healings attributed to a Roman Catholic Marian healing shrine. All right? I saw it. Now, I didn't see anyone on the pilgrimage get out of up from their stretcher. And what horrified me, they've been told in bad theology, if you go to Lourdes and you really believe, you will be cured, was the word. You will be. So I was waiting for, these people are going to be so desolate. They've not only been told that they're sick and they're staying sick, but your faith isn't, it's your fault. Mm. So I watched, why aren't these people absolutely crushed? They weren't. I would have to say they were healed, therapy. Something happened. You can explain it by the community of the sick, the processions, the whole world of the sick, a world for them. But they went back, I'm going to say healed. I never saw anyone cured. Now, maybe if I wasn't there, some other time it happened. So I'm holding on to that. I'm also holding on to being to Esculapius shrines at, Kos, Pergamon, Epidaurus. And what I find is the same type of things attributed there, in testimonials I'm talking about. And some must have happened because people wrote them down. They're not just propaganda. The same things though, blind, deaf, mute, troubles with pregnancy, lame, the same things that are characteristic of Lourdes, same thing characteristic of Esculapius, same things characteristic of Jesus. So as a historian, I am absolutely convinced that Jesus was a major healer. Now, any given case there, you can say it's a typical case rather than an individual, fine. But he was a major healer. So as a historian then, I have to ask myself, why do I think was he conning everyone? What was happening? I think that's an historical question. What is happening? If they want to call it miracle, that's a separate issue. But I still want to know the phenomenon itself. Now, at Esculapius, I find that the testimonials are all talking about deaf, mute. But then the stories say he raised the dead. So the stories of the healings come from his department of medical records, and the raising of the dead comes from his Department of Public Relations. I don't, but Zeus in the story had to kill him because he was messing up the proportions of the universe. I don't believe for a second he raised the dead. But raising the dead tells me big-time healer. So I get to Jesus. If he doesn't raise the dead, he's not a big-time healer, even though they're very careful about it. So Jesus is a major healer. Now, how do I think he did it? I'm going to tell you how I think he did it. These are glasses. I've had to wear them all my life. Without them, I'm a scholar all my life. Technically, I would be blind. What happens to a person in the first century who is blind? Blind in the sense that I am, trying to read without glasses or without visual aids. He's a burden to his family. He's a burden to his village. I think what Jesus is doing with this kingdom of God is taking people like that into a new community. Is he curing them? I honestly don't think so. I think if somebody came up to Jesus who'd had his eyes gouged out in a battle or something and was still alive and was blind, do I think Jesus could touch him and make him see? No, I don't. I don't.
See, I think this is where horizons come in.
It's probably where horizons come in. It's probably where horizons come in.
And the question is, can historians investigate miracle claims? And I think so. I think what you're answering here is, did Jesus perform miracles?
No, I really am, honestly. No, I honestly haven't yet. I'm trying to understand what they're telling me happened.
Yeah.
If when they said Jesus put his hands on them and he saw, if I could be there at that moment, was I seeing, as it were, the person with the eyes gouged out, which I would agree with you would be beyond any medical explanation.
Let's just say the person was born blind and then all of a sudden they can see. I mean, that would be a miracle, right?
No, I don't think so.
Really? If they're
I don't
blind
know.
and then they can see.
I don't know.
Why wouldn't that be a miracle?
It may be quite within our possibilities.
But you are ruling on all right. So you do think, all right, the answer for you is historians can investigate miracle claims, but when it comes to things like miracles like raising the dead, you're adjudicating on that and you're saying that did not happen. So you're acting as a historian there. What I want to know is why you don't think Jesus could raise the dead.
Okay, I'm looking at the stories we have. We have the three. Jairus' daughter, they're very careful. Maybe she's in a coma.
Jairus' daughter, widow's son,
okay.
And...
Lazarus.
Yeah,
okay.
Lazarus.
It's almost like he's working at it. Jairus' daughter, coma, sleep, or dead, we don't know. Okay, on the way to the tomb, that sounds more like it. But Lazarus, the one that should be the best, Lazarus is an almost brutal parody on the idea of raising the dead, coming up with the final statement that no, I am the resurrection and the life, and if you believe in me, you'll never die. And at that point, whether we like it or not, he ain't using death the way he's been using it all the way through that story. I think John is parodying the idea of literally kind of raising the dead, kind of coming out of the tomb, that idea. Because I am the resurrection and life, believe in me, you will not die.
Yeah, but then he says to Mary, he says, you believe this? Do you believe this? Or is it Martha? He says to one of them, do you believe this? And she says, yes, I know that we will see, we will be raised in the general resurrection. And then it's as though because he is the resurrection, he has that power. And it is in John, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about how he has that power in him. I think it's John chapter 5 or 9 or 13, one of those, where he says he can raise the dead. He has that power to do so. So if he is the resurrection in that sense, I think you could take him as saying he has the power to raise the dead, and that's what he does in John. But even if whatever would happen in John there, that still wouldn't account for Luke, the widow's son, and it wouldn't account for Matthew and Mark talking about raising of Jairus' daughter.
So would you really believe, let me go literal for a moment, that Jesus could raise the dead, and this is it?
What do you mean, this is it?
One maybe, one possibly, One, maybe she's sleeping.
Well, why do you say possibly? Because they came out and said, your daughter is dead.
Yeah, I know, but why can't they come right out and say it if that's what they want to say?
They did. Remember, in Mark or Luke's version, you have Jairus come up and says, my daughter's about to die.
And the people then...
And then on the way, the servants come out and say,
yeah.
don't trouble him anymore. Your daughter is now dead.
Yeah.
So, I mean, she's dead.
Yeah.
The widow's son is dead. Lazarus is dead. And Jesus raises them. So I'm not saying we got enough evidence to prove it, okay? But that's another issue.
Yeah.
But I mean, the question they're asking is, can historians investigate miracle claims and adjudicate on them? And I think I've said yes, and I think from your answer, you'd say yes. We just arrive at different conclusions on some things.
I don't want to I agree with that.
Okay.
I really did. The most you could say, when they say in Lourdes, there is no medical evidence to explain this, I want to laugh. I don't give medicine or doctors, to be honest with you, that sort of power that they can tell me what's going on half the time.
Yeah.
I'm 84 years of age, and they don't know what's going on half the time. Believe me, I'm very happy for them to be around. But
that's why we get second and third opinions.
What
right?
What I really don't want to do is give up immediately. Somebody said, "Well, I don't believe in miracles, so I'll skip this." I want to say, tell me what you think is happening, even as a historian. Then, or another way of saying it, don't tell me you don't believe in the devil. I want to know why there's so many epileptics, if you want to say that, at the time of Jesus. How come all of a sudden we have demoniacs all over the place in the first century? Where were they in the Old Testament? Who's creating demoniacs? The Romans, I think.
I'm ready to go on.
Sorry, I know we're ignoring you, aren't we? Is there a timekeeper?
Dr. Crossan, did Jesus rise from the dead?
Absolutely. But I consider it metaphorical and not literal. And if you act accordingly, by taking it metaphorically, it becomes reality. Now, let me unpack that just a little bit. I will be careful on time. Every major incident in the life of Jesus, let's put it this way, is recorded in the New Testament. I mean, if you were painting the New Testament, you'd know what the flight into Egypt was like. The Transfiguration is described. The Ascension is described twice. The only one that is never described is the resurrection itself, the most important of them all. There are lots of stories about women and men at the tomb. Women and men. There's lots of stories of women and men having visions afterwards. Almost too many of them. Why don't they describe the actual resurrection? They show you the effects, they show you the consequences, they show you the results. They never describe the most important moment himself. If somebody said to Paul, okay, Paul, we got it. We know what a crucifixion looks like. You don't have to describe that. Tell us what the resurrection was like. If we were there, what would we have seen? Now, secondly, what we have in our Western tradition that you all know in the art is Jesus coming out of the tomb. It's quite easy to imagine it. You can ask without being stupid or unreasonable, could you have a camera there and filmed it? People have asked that. The whole Eastern tradition, which is closer to the New Testament tradition, has Jesus taking Adam and Eve, that is the human race, out with him. So now you're asking me, do I take literally that Jesus came out of the tomb as in the Western tradition? I at least can imagine that. I really could imagine that, take that literally. I don't. But if you take it literally and I take it metaphorically, what I really want to discuss with you is what it means for you. Because that, I think, is a first century question. I don't think if Paul takes it as literally as he wants and describes it to his Corinthians, whatever, here's what actually happened. And they say, if we had a camera there, an iPhone, could we have taken a picture? And he says, yes, you could. Then he would still have to say, well, sure, we've heard that story about Romulus. And the Romans are even telling it about more or less Julius Caesar. Yeah, he doesn't come out of the tomb, but the spirit goes up to God. So what are you telling us that's particularly new? Why should we care about it? On the other hand, in the Eastern tradition, the resurrection is about the whole human race. Now, there is no way I can take that literally. Jesus taking the hand, the limp wrist actually, of Adam and Eve and taking them out of the sepulchre as the beginning of the general resurrection? How do I take that literally? I can take the Western one literally. I don't, but I could at least. I can't take the Eastern one. So yeah, I think what we have to decide is, what is the resurrection? How is it distinct from an ascension? Why did, in Jewish matrix, they come up with resurrection rather than ascension? It would be very simple to have found an empty tomb, have had visions and say Jesus has ascended up to God, like Enoch, or like Elijah, like possibly Moses even. He is with God. Why did they say resurrection? That's the question as a historian I have to face. And what does it mean then, I can ask. And then as a Christian, do I believe in it and live accordingly? Yes. And I think if I was discussing this with Paul and I wanted to debate with him literal, metaphorical, he would say, get over it, Dominic. Are you living a resurrected life? Well, I'm trying, but I'm not doing too good, Paul. That's all he would care about. Because he's telling you the general resurrection has begun. If you're a Christian, you're not waiting for the resurrection. Maybe there is some come, but you're living it. And he would want to know, are you living it? And he would say to me, get over your little debates, because they're all excuses for getting on with it.
I think Paul would go far beyond that. And I think he makes that clear. In 1 Corinthians 15, he's answering, the Corinthians are saying to him, they ask him two questions. How are the dead raised, and with what body do they come? And he says, okay, let me answer this. And he gives a bunch of things, but he says, all right. Verse 20, he says, Christ is the firstfruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. And then 3 verses later, he says, each in his own order, Christ the firstfruits. After that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So in other words, Jesus was raised, according to Paul, in the first century, year 30 or 33. And we're going to be raised, Christians raised, when Jesus returns. Now, how does that look like? What kind of body does that look like? He gives the analogy of a seed. It's planted one way, it's raised another way, okay? There's continuity and there's discontinuity there. But then he goes on in contrast, he says, you know, it's sown as a corruptible body, it's raised incorruptible. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's sown as a natural body, it's raised as a spiritual body. And then he talks about how later on in the chapter, we who are alive, you know, at the time, we're going to be changed. Our bodies are going to be changed. In 2 Corinthians 5:8, he says, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So this view that Paul has is when we die, our bodies are buried, our spirit leaves our body and goes to be with Christ in heaven. Whereas a disembodied spirit. And then when Christ returns, he brings our spirits back with him, puts it back in our corpses, resurrects our corpses, and transforms them into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. And this is precisely the image that we find in 1 Thessalonians 4, when Paul is encouraging the Christians about those who have already died as believers. And he says, hey, we don't want you to grieve as those who don't have this hope. But when Christ returns, he's going to bring those dead in Christ with him. And then the trumpet will sound, and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing them back with him, how are they going to be raised? Simple. He's bringing back the spirits of believers with him. And then they're going to be put back in the bodies, and those bodies are going to be raised and transformed. It is a bodily, physical resurrection. We're going to be raised just as Christ was raised. And Paul says elsewhere that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Resurrection's part of that. And So this is really important for Paul. Resurrection is important. It is a physical, bodily resurrection. Yes, he wants it to transform our lives. Paul uses resurrection as metaphor elsewhere, but he uses it here in a real physical, bodily sense. It matters to him. That's how we know Christianity is true, that Jesus is who he claimed to be. It's like when people questioned him, he said, in John, kill me, and in 3 days I'll rise from the dead. Or the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the great fish, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth, and then he will raise. So he predicts his death. He predicts his resurrection. And this is consistent with what we find in all 4 Gospels. Christianity is true because Jesus rose from the dead. That's the test by which we can know. It's not just a metaphor, a nice thought by which we can use to live our lives. The earliest Christians are looking at it as an event that occurred in history. And when we look at how the skeptics responded to it, they said the disciples stole the body, the gardener reburied the body, Jesus faked his death. And the Christians, so they understood the Christians to be claiming it as a literal event. And notice how the Christians did not respond. They didn't say, get over it. It's just a metaphor. It doesn't matter. Are you living the Christian life? No, they defended the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So I think we have every reason to believe that the resurrection was meant to be understood as a real event, and no really good reasons to think that it wasn't. And in terms of the Eastern tradition, I've read Dominic's stuff. He appeals to the Odes of Solomon, which is a hymnal in the early 2nd century. I mean, I don't appeal to hymns like, in the garden, he walks with me and talks with me and tells me I am his own. I mean, that's poetry. It's not meant to be interpreted. There's flexibilities in it. He goes with 2 frescoes in churches in Egypt, built in the 4th and 5th century. Art. He goes with the Gospel of Peter, which by his own admission is middle of the 2nd century. He says it's even dependent on all 4 Gospels. It's preserved in a single fragment dated 550 plus years after Jesus. And based on that, hypothesizes a cross gospel for which there isn't a scrap of evidence and for which he hasn't been able to convince a single other scholar in the universe. So Eastern tradition might be that. I want to know what the apostles taught. And they seem to have meant that it was a literal, physical event.
Mm-hmm. Just please be careful. You slipped in the word real instead of literal. You said...
I said literal.
You did say real. You said...
Okay.
But just
real.
Because it's important for me. If you ask me, must a Christian believe in the resurrection? Yes. If I have no vested interest or professional job. I would be quite ready to say it's rubbish if I thought it was rubbish. I really would. And Paul's rubbish for thinking it, if I thought that was right. I think it is a metaphor. I don't think you can take it literally because, for example, when Paul says the first fruits of those who have slept, that's exactly the same expression used in Matthew, as you know, when they come out of the tombs.
Well, actually, no, in Matthew, those raised saints are the first fruits then, not Jesus, because they're raised at Jesus' death, not his resurrection. And I think that that's probably just portents anyway.
No, it's not. It's they're trying to fit this into the Jewish tradition where the idea of a single person starting the general resurrection is absurd, because obviously, what about all the ones up to that point? Okay, if we're starting the general resurrection now, fine. Jesus can't come out alone. So the sleepers is their expression for it. Matthew has it, and you're right, by the way, it's poetry. And some of the most important stuff is in poetry. They're the hymns. That's what people chant. Before anyone's writing gospels, they're probably chanting hymns. So the sleepers, if you will, those who have slept, is verbatim in Matthew and in Paul. And it's also in the Gospel of Peter.
I don't think they say that they were sleeping in Matthew.
No, I'm sorry. Those who have slept is their expression for the dead.
Right.
Maybe just the just among the dead, but who had to arise with Jesus. Because otherwise we're not talking about the general resurrection. So the important thing for me is that whether you take this literally or metaphorically, I don't know how you could possibly take the plurality literally. Did nobody notice the other empty tombs?
Yeah, I don't take that literally in Matthew 27 with those race saints.
You take that metaphorically.
I take, well, here's how I take it as special effects, as portents, pretty much like Livy reports when Julius Caesar is assassinated. Pale ghosts are seen at sunset, that black intestines are seen outside of cattle. There's a darkness, there's a comet, that, things like that. That's how I understand that. I don't really see that as the heroine of hell.
That's fair enough, that parallel with the darkening of the sun and the moon and all the rest of it. That's exactly the same thing, the portents at the death of Jesus. But Matthew has a problem. They come out at the death of Jesus. Then he has them kind of hover around because they can't appear before Jesus. You're right. So this is a typical piece of Jewish tradition that Matthew has got wherever, and he's stuck with because he's trying to insert it into a Markan story, and it doesn't fit into a story. Because what are you going to do with these?
Mark already has the darkness in the temple.
Oh yeah, no, he's all that. I know that.
Okay,
but he doesn't.
So Matthew is just commingling those things.
Yeah,
and we find that in ancient Greco-Roman literature, where we can confirm a comet that's reported actually was there, but we can also disconfirm that there was an eclipse of the sun at that point. So we can see that
we're in agreement here. We're in agreement on this.
Okay.
It's that these people raise at the death of Jesus, and they appear with Jesus.
No, they didn't say they appeared with Jesus. It said after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to others.
Too many, or something like that. Okay. Yeah. So I think they're trying to describe a multitude rising with Jesus.
See, I'm just not with that. I don't agree with you there. But bracket that on whether that's what Matthew's doing.
Okay.
We still have Mark, who's getting his information from Peter. We've got Paul.
Okay.
You got Mark. All right, so we still, all right, at minimum, you'll admit, you got Mark, you got John, you got Paul. We got three independent sources, multiple independent sources that are reporting a physical, literal resurrection of Jesus.
But of course, for you, Mark gets it from Peter.
Yep, even if Mark didn't get it from Peter, okay, I think he did. But even if he didn't, Mark is independent of John. So you got Mark, John, and Paul, and all three of them talk about a physical, bodily resurrection. And in fact, Paul goes on to say, if Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised. Your faith is worthless. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Okay? So it's that important to Paul. They're all multiple independent sources, early sources, rooted in eyewitness testimony, that's talking about a physical, literal resurrection of Jesus. That's pretty strong. That's a lot more than metaphor. And let's face
You're
it,
back again with metaphor, just a metaphor.
They are first century sources, and all the stuff that you have for the Eastern stuff, the 2nd century, 4th century, 5th century.
I'm not arguing for that.
Okay.
I didn't bring that in tonight. I really didn't. The only thing I'm bringing in tonight is this is the major event in the life of Jesus. Why does nobody describe it?
But that's positive then. Because if no one was there and they're not describing, like the Gospel of Peter describes it in his very fanciful way with the giant Jesus and a walking, talking cross. We don't have that in the Gospels. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual event, except perhaps the guards in Matthew. So they could have invented it, but they didn't. So I think that that could easily show that because they didn't invent it, but they still talk about the empty tomb, and they talk about the post-resurrection appearances, that they didn't invent it, I think works in, if anything, to the authenticity of the accounts.
I don't see that the most important event in the life of Jesus, if they have a nice, clear, literal view, like most of us do have, because we've been watching art for the Western art shows Jesus there, he's rising up. It looks quite literal to me. If I leave everything out and I just look at those images, that's what most people are imagining. If they ask, Jesus comes out of the tomb and there's maybe a flash of light or whatever, and he ascends. It's not that hard to describe it. But that's not, I think, what they're talking about. They're talking about a metaphor for the resurrection of the human race. And I don't know how on earth you can, well, I shouldn't say I don't know how, because they have Adam and Eve representing the human race. been coming out with Jesus.
But yeah, but that's the frescoes from the 4th and 5th century. That's not New Testament. That's not first century literature.
But we're talking about when people first tried to draw what they had been talking about.
In the 4th and 5th centuries.
No, not in the 4th.
And
no,
it's
no, no.
art.
No, not in the 4th.
It's not biography, it's art.
It's in, no, it's in Ignatius of Antioch. I mean, it's already there. It was taken for granted in the 1st century because resurrection meant, let me put it this way, there was no tradition there was no Jewish tradition of a single person resurrecting. Ascending,
Yeah,
yes.
I agree. No, I agree.
So to say that would be almost incomprehensible. To say that the general resurrection has begun with Jesus alone, I would say is incomprehensible.
Well, why does Paul say Christ is the firstfruits?
Because the firstfruits is not just Jesus. That's why Matthew, as I said, has the same expression. He doesn't use firstfruits, as you know, but he says those who have slept. What's it? Perfect. He says this is the same expression. Ton kekaimenon, or something like that. Ton kekaimenon. Look,
It's 27:52 and 53, right?
or give or take. Something like ton kekaimenon, the word we get coma from. Those who have slept.
It's a 52. Yeah.
Everybody get out their
Kekome
Greek
menon.
handbooks. You know.
Yeah, those who had been sleeping.
Those who had been sleeping.
Who
That's
have
the
been
same
sleeping.
thing
It's
that
in the perfect
Paul would
tense.
use in 1 Corinthians. Same expression. So I don't know if we're dealing with some kind of a technical expression for all the dead, or at least all the good dead. Maybe we're not taking them all out, that everyone knew about. So those who have slept.
Except that they are raised when Jesus died. They're raised ahead of Jesus, okay? Whereas Paul says Christ is the firstfruits. So you either have to admit that Matthew contradicts Paul, which you're free to do if you like, or you say, well, maybe Matthew is using some portents there, and he's not meaning to talk about the harrowing of hell with this, or that the beginning of the general resurrection involved multiple people. Christ is the firstfruits, and then it says those who belong to him will be raised at his coming, at the parousia.
Yeah, that's the future. That's the future.
Yeah.
The question is whether any Jews or Jewish Christians or Christian Jews could imagine Christ arising alone, not ascending alone, of course,
Right.
but arising alone, granted future and all the rest. We're not talking about that. Without saying, but what about other good Jews who died on Roman crosses?
But then why just them and not us? Or why not them and not everybody else? If you have a problem with it just being Jesus and then the rest of the parousia, then why not have the same problem with Jesus plus a few others and then the rest of the parousia?
Because that's what we're not talking about. We're not talking about the parousia at the moment. That's a separate issue for me. I'm trying to kind of focus on the resurrection of Jesus.
Right, but you're talking
Whether
about
he's
the general
alone.
resurrection. You have problems thinking that Jews of that time would have thought that Jesus could have been the only one. I agree with that, all right?
Yeah.
And there's a paradigm shift that takes place with the early Christians and saying, yep, we didn't expect it this way, but Jesus is the firstfruits. And then Paul's answering, or the rest of us are going to be raised at his coming. But the fact that he's saying this and can think that we live as a disembodied spirit in the meantime when we die, he's thinking of a physical bodily resurrection. And this is exactly what all four Gospels are presenting. They're narrating a physical bodily resurrection.
Now, by the way, the argument...
Very quickly.
The argument all four Gospels agree doesn't move me so much. Matthew and Luke copy Mark. I am not convinced. And with 50%,
they don't copy him on the appearances.
whether John is a separate version. John has a tradition, without any doubt, as far as I'm concerned. But when he gets into the crucifixion and resurrection, he looks awfully much like Mark rewritten to have Jesus in charge of everything. That's the way I read John. Everything in there, you can say, Mark says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? No way, John says. Jesus looks around and says, I guess it's all over now. I'm gone. I mean, Jesus is totally control of Mark.
Yeah, in John.
And John, sorry, in John. So I'm afraid he's he knows Mark and is rewriting him to be Jesus almost running his own crucifixion and his resurrection and his burial. By the way.
He may very well have been.
So I've only one witness, in other words.
He may. Well, you got Paul.
Oh yes, yeah. Paul.
Okay, so that's
yeah,
two.
Sorry, the Gospels.
And the thing is, if John is rooted in the eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples, be it the son of Zebedee or a minor disciple, and if Mark is rooted in the eyewitness testimony of Peter, whether John knew Peter or Mark and was rewriting him to some extent, you still have two guys, two independent sources who are attesting to the resurrection.
Yeah, but you still haven't faced the issue.
At some point, I mean, this could go on for another 2,000 years at this point.
But all of that data could interpret it as ascension. Let me take it as literally as possible, just for the point of view. Everything happens exactly the way it's accounted there. The real question that we still have as a historian is, why didn't they simply say, within their tradition, or even the Greco-Roman tradition, Jesus is clearly ascended. Romulus is ascended, we've all come back and seen him, so Jesus is ascended. What made them say resurrection? Because resurrection is not just about Jesus. It has to be about the past, then it can be about the future. We're not debating the future now at the moment. That's a separate issue. I don't think it's possible to talk about the resurrection of Jesus for Paul without imagining, at least. But of course, others came with him. Now, he might want to say only the just came with him. He might want to say, the rest can stay in hell or wherever. But I don't think any Jew or Christian Jew in the first century, including Paul, could conceive of a resurrection for Jesus alone. Ascension, yes. Resurrection, no.
Feel free to respond, but in your closing
statement. And
statement.
then I shut up.
Okay.
Closing statements.
Oh. All right. Well, this has been fun. I mean, truly, this is just fun. It's great talking shop. And, but I think that what we're able to see is the difference between horizons here, the disparity of horizons, even amongst Dominic and myself. I have no problems with saying there's a supernatural being, that there's a supernatural dimension of reality. Now, I look at some other things. I'll look at things such as near-death experiences, for which there are about 100, 200 that are really, really well evidenced. We have corroborating data where a person, it appears that they have an out-of-body experience, and then based on that out-of-body experience, they receive accurate information they could not have possibly known otherwise, except had they been outside of their body. There's some fraudulent claims like that, and most of them can't be verified. There's about 100 to 200 that can. All right? There's a number of things that would radically answered prayer. Craig Keener has also done some study, and he's interviewed eyewitnesses over, his wife is from the Congo, and gone over, and even people in his family, his mother-in-law, and so they have witnessed things like the raising of the dead. He's talked to people who have seen people who, like a woman who went in her town to a witch doctor. She had gone blind, the witch doctor couldn't do anything, and as a last resort, they went to a pastor in the village, and he said, please pray for us. And he says, I don't know that you, and he prayed for her. Anyway, he says, I can't guarantee he prayed, and she was healed. She got her eyesight back. He documents a bunch of miracles like this. So I do think that there is a spiritual dimension of reality, that miracles, genuine miracles, not just psychosomatic stuff, but real divine miracles occur today. I don't think Dominic thinks that. So that's a difference in our horizons, okay? When I look at the New Testament, the early literature, especially those that appear rooted in eyewitness testimony, it seems to me that these earliest Christians believed that Jesus was more than just God in the sense that Caesar was, that the Romans claimed of Caesar. He's the creator and sustainer of the universe. Where did they get this idea? As monotheistic Jews, and I think the only reason can be, the only plausible explanation is Jesus made claims to this effect, whether implicitly or through his actions. I think we've got really good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. The earliest Christians, the earliest literature we have, all talk about a physically, literally resurrected Jesus. And the Apostle Paul, who knew the Jerusalem apostles, that we can verify that they certified that his gospel message was the same thing they were preaching. That doesn't mean they verified everything he said was the same thing or that there was no disagreements. But the gospel message, that basic message about Jesus, the kingdom, and what he preached, that he was in agreement with them. Certainly that included who he was and about his resurrection. So if Paul is preaching a literal bodily resurrection, that's what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching as well. And Paul said if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. And Paul didn't mean just metaphor with Jesus, because if he meant that with Jesus, then he meant that with us as well. And I want to think that my afterlife is more than just a metaphor that will exist in the minds of my loved ones who survived me. That's not what Paul was talking about. He said, if the dead aren't raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. He meant it, and they staked their lives, and many of them died for it, because they truly believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And this is what skeptics, how they interpreted the Christians, and the Christians responded to those skeptics by defending the bodily, historical resurrection of Jesus. This is what we look at with historical Jesus research. We apply these principles. Now, I applaud Dominic for looking at the practical applications and the theology behind a metaphor. But for me, if Christ has not been raised, the metaphor might be nice, but that's not going to cause me to follow Christ. If it comes to a point where I have to give up my life or face possible imprisonment, torture, and execution, I don't care about the metaphor any longer. The only thing that's going to sustain me during that time is my confidence that Christianity is true, because Jesus rose from the dead, and because he lives, I will live too. Thanks.
Well, I wouldn't want to die, but I would only die for a metaphor. If all I'm talking about is that Jesus rose literally from the dead, good for Jesus. People die for metaphors. They will even die for a metaphor, not because they have some idea of an afterlife. They won't die for a piece of real estate between Mexico and Canada, but they might die for their homeland. Not because they're going to live on afterwards or anything else. People will die for metaphors. The horrible thing is some people die for horrible metaphors. So I take metaphor more seriously than anyone who doesn't could understand, because it is our destiny. Now, after all the time I've spent with Jesus, here's what is most important for me. The Romans, go back to the Romans, crucified the leaders of nonviolent groups alone. If you're the leader of a nonviolent group of opposition, we might call them activists. The Romans did not crucify philosophers. You might boot them out of Rome, but they didn't they crucified what we would call activists. So Jesus was crucified, but his followers were not rounded up. I take that as an historical fact. I take it from Josephus at the end of the first century, Jewish historian, Tacitus at the beginning of the second century, trying to explain what these weird Christians were. They were followers of Christ who started a movement over there. We executed them to stop it, and doggone it, it didn't stop. It spread. Tacitus says, like a disease, and everything rotten eventually arrives in Rome, so it came here too. Josephus is a little bit more polite. He says those who loved him before loved him afterwards. But they both understand it. We executed the follower of a nonviolent movement, and it didn't stop the movement. Now, I take that as a fundamental fact. You know from the story of Barabbas, which I think, by the way, is parable, not history, that Barabbas in Mark's Gospel is in jail with the others. Romans are going to crucify them all in a nice row. They're a violent group. Jesus is going to be crucified alone. According to Roman law, anyone who stirs up the people or creates a tumult, who we call an activist, will, according to their rank, I'm quoting now, either be crucified, cast to the beasts, or sent to an island. Never quite understood why being sent to an Aegean island is a punishment, but I've never been there for a winter, so maybe that's something else. That tells me the most important thing. Jesus died for non-violent resistance to violence itself, not just to Rome. Rome was just the normalcy of civilization. The resurrection means for me that God is on the side of that. I cannot imagine the crucifixion without the resurrection. It's just a brutal death without the resurrection. It is God's vindication that the way to handle violence is non-violence, because violence escalates violence more and more. Maybe they didn't know that in the first century, but we know it today. So if I have only one thing of Jesus, only one thing, and I have this one thing, he died for non-violent resistance to the normal violence of imperialism. Not just to Rome. Rome was just the Mediterranean version of it in the first century. I think that is, for me, an evolutionary challenge. How will we, granted the escalatory violence that is the normalcy of civilization, if you don't know what I'm talking about that it took, I think, 63 years to get from the Wright Flyer, the Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to the stealth bomber. We are really good at violence. So what is going to stop us destroying ourselves except nonviolence? That is the challenge of Jesus, and it's vindicated by the resurrection. It is for me a metaphor for the future of our species if we have a future. That is why it is so vital. Thank you.
So we now move on to our final portion of this evening's dialogue, questions and answers. So those of you who have a question for Dr. Licona, please line up on this side of the aisle. There is a microphone toward the front of the auditorium here, and likewise those for questions for Dr. Crossan, line up over here. And while you're doing so, I will give you a couple of announcements. I believe most of you were handed one of these slips this evening. This is an encouragement for you to go to a surveymonkey.com and fill out a survey about this evening's event, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you wanted to see more of, so on and so forth. And also, you are please invited to an event on November 7th at 7:30 p.m. in the Social Sciences Building, room 3030. Ratio Christie, one of the groups hosting this event, will be hosting Georgia Tech Professor of Chemistry, Dr. David Sherrill, who will be giving a talk on the topic, Science and Faith, Enemies or Allies. We'll take a question over here first.
Hi, thank you for this great talk. So Dr. Licona, my question was that you have alluded to Paul a lot in your talk, but historically Paul was not an eyewitness. And I don't think there's a way to really figure out whether his experience on the road to Damascus, historians can figure out whether that happened or not. So how do we know that historically Paul did not affect the Gospels as he was the earliest writer, or Christianity in general? And the other question pertaining to literal and metaphoric Jesus as being portrayed as God was that in the Old Testament there are a lot of figures that are called God. Angels are called God, judges are called God, Moses is called God. And that's alluded in John chapter 10, where Jesus actually refers to that why are you stoning me? Because, referring to Psalm 82. So if the author of John from the gospel, the prologue literally meant God, why would he put in, for example, 17:3, which terms Father as the only true God? Or ends the gospel by saying that I've written all of this so that you may know that he's the Messiah, the Son of God, not creator of the universe, right?
Good questions. So I would say with John, he does distinguish Jesus from other so-called gods because he talks about Jesus being the creator of the universe. All things came into being by him, and through him nothing came into being that came into being. And you have Paul saying the same thing in a couple different places. 1 Corinthians 8:6, and Colossians 1:16 and 17, where Jesus is the creator and sustainer of the universe. So, I mean, this is quite different than others. So, in terms of Paul, Paul does claim to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 8, he says, "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me." And 1 Corinthians 9, he says, "Has not Jesus appeared to me? So, or have I not seen Jesus?" So he does claim to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. He may, we don't know, but he may have seen Jesus preach during his lifetime. I mean, every time you turn around the Gospels, Jesus is up in Jerusalem at a festival, Passover, whatever. Paul would have been there as well. Who knows? Paul was a Pharisee coming up through the ranks. He may very well have been at the trial of Jesus. We don't know. But he certainly claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. In Galatians chapter 1, he says that 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter for 15 days. And the Greek word is hysteresai, meaning he was getting some information about Jesus. He hadn't walked with Jesus, so he wants to get the whole 9 yards from someone who had. You know, "Hey, Paul, I heard he walked on water," or "Peter, you walked on water. Did he really do that? What was it like? Were you walking on water too at some point? And how did you feel? Or what did he say to you when you were at the campfire after talking to the crowds all day?" So, and then he goes back up 14 years later and runs the gospel message past them to verify that he's saying the same thing that they're saying. So this is before any of the Gospels are written. So even if we didn't have any of the Gospels, we can get a basic message from Paul of what the apostles were preaching. So did his preaching influence any of the Gospels? Maybe at maximum Luke's Gospel, but I don't think so, because Paul wouldn't have been around during that time. And Luke said he got his information. It's kind of ambiguous. He's either saying he got it from eyewitnesses or those who knew the eyewitnesses. He certainly get it from Mark. Whether he got some from Paul, I don't know, but I don't see any Pauline influence in the others.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crossan, for being here. You mentioned that you affirm historians use the criteria of authenticity. Given that Jesus' proper burial described in the New Testament fulfills the criterion of multiple attestation and the criterion of embarrassment, as women were the ones who anointed Jesus' body in the burial process, and given that Jesus' proper burial is consistent with Josephus tells us that Rome allowed Jews to follow their customs, including taking the crucified victims off the cross and burying them, how do you reconcile this with your view that it's plausible that Jesus was thrown into a common grave and eaten by wild dogs?
All right, just a correction of fact. I didn't say we should. I agree we had to have criteria. I did not say we should use the double differentiation, but leave that aside. The problem with the burial for me is this. When I look again from Mark into Matthew and Luke and into John, I'm seeing that as a stream of tradition. It's getting better and better all the time. I'm trying to imagine what was there before Mark. When Mark, the best Mark can say is that maybe some pious Jew named buried him out of respect for, like Tobias. Now, I want to know, as a historian, is that hope or history? Do they really have facts? And if they have facts, why does it have to keep getting better in Matthew and Luke and John? Of course, the burial of Jesus is the burial of a god. It's a magnificent burial. I don't think they knew what happened to Jesus. And while it is true that you could certainly bribe your way, if you had enough money, to get the guards to give you the body, of course you could. That's the only way you could. The function of crucifixion was to hang you up there as state terrorism, to warn you, don't do what this guy did or you'll end up like he has. So I don't think the Romans obeyed the Jewish expectation that you don't leave a crucified up overnight on the cross. I don't think the Romans cared. Their function was to leave it up there as long as they wanted. So I don't know how we can be sure of what happened to the body of Jesus. I don't know how to do it. Maybe Mark is telling us history with Joseph of Arimathea. But boy, John really has to clean that up with Nicodemus and the huge amount of spice. It's like they don't know what happened, and the best they can do is, surely some pious Jew took care of the body.
Is that all right?
To be fair, we're running short on time. We have.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll give them preference. Sorry, Michael.
Okay.
First of all, gentlemen, thank you for your time and coming and share your knowledge of historical Jesus and Christianity. Appreciate it very much. My question, I'm just curious, are there any new documents or fragments that have come to light in the last, recently, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years, something roughly, that have really added significantly to the body of knowledge about the historical Jesus? And if so, what has it? How has it added to it?
No. Recently, I think earlier this year, it was revealed that there's this Mark fragment that has been discussed for a while, and that has finally been dated, I think, to early 2nd century, and would be the earliest fragment or manuscript of a portion of Mark that we have, but it didn't change anything from what our text says right now.
Yeah, my question is Dr. Crossan, because you've been talking about metaphor versus literal and such. My wife and I have been married for 8 years, and we do have a great love for one another, but we also know our time here is always limited. And when we see a literal resurrection of Jesus, and he says, because I live, you shall live also, and live forever, eternal, that brings us a lot of great joy. That's the difference it makes. What can a metaphorical resurrection do for us that would be even close to what a literal one is?
Because the metaphor is for the future of the human race. So what you've just said, that really the importance of the resurrection for Jesus is that you're going to get one too. I don't expect that. I accept that I will not have that. But the metaphor is about the salvation, redemption of the human race, whether we are going to destroy ourselves, or whether, as I said, nonviolent resistance is the only mode of countering violence that will redeem the human species. Now, if you're convinced, of course, there's a heaven and a hell in the future and God's going to fix it all up no matter what we do, that's different. I think we are responsible for our own future.
Great. So I have a question about the ascension, and I know the resurrection is important in making a case for Christianity, but it seems like the ascension kind of gets pushed aside. And when you evaluate the ascension, and you see it, Matthew looks like it happens in Galilee, Acts mentions 40 days, and I know even Paul mentions 500 people seeing Jesus at one time, which would, I suppose, happen during that 40 days. So a lot of things kind of don't connect, and I see that as a bit of an objection. So I'm curious if maybe you've ever thought through, or has anyone ever made such a historical case for the ascension, and how do you maybe deal with some of those areas that seem to not match up very well?
Yeah, well, I don't see any of those things not matching up just because, let's say, the Gospels don't mention the appearance to the more than 500 at one point, or all the appearances. None of them are doing all the appearances. In fact, it seems to me that Matthew and Luke compresses the time. So you have appearance to women in Matthew, but the appearance to the male disciples doesn't happen until Galilee, all right? And then that's kind of like the end of it there in the appearance to the male disciples in Galilee. Luke kind of combines them all together to have occurred on Easter, the resurrection, all the appearances, and the ascension. He does know that this happened over a period of time because Acts chapter 1, he says it happened over a period of 40 days. But he's just compressing them all. into one day, just time compression, a common literary device. Why he does it, I don't know. Maybe it's to increase the intensity. Maybe it's to keep the focus on Jerusalem, which was the headquarters of the Christian church. Maybe it was because he was running out of space on his scroll and just did that to compress. I don't know why. But none of them are trying to report all the appearances. And notice that in 1 Corinthians 15, the women aren't mentioned because the Paul causes kerygma. It's the official formal public proclamation for which the appearance to women would have detracted in that culture. So he doesn't mention them. But I don't see any kind of tension between them. Now, why don't historians talk a lot about the ascension? Maybe because we just don't have enough evidence to verify it. And, you've got multiple independent sources that talk about Jesus' death. Multiple independent sources, even those rooted in eyewitness testimony, talking about his physical resurrection. We just don't have that with the ascension.
A couple more brief ones.
Okay. This is a question for Dr. Crossan. Well, I see and respect your viewpoint about the metaphor about the bodily resurrection, right? But I don't see, if you're a first century Roman peasant or farmer or whatever, and Paul comes to you and says, Christ is risen, or Jesus is risen, but it's only a metaphor. Don't worry about it. I don't think it'd be a compelling enough reason. You have a metaphor versus, Caesar is the living God or whatever, right? So there are a lot of nice metaphors. There's nice metaphors in Star Wars or, the Chronicles of Narnia or whatever. But if you have a real thing versus a metaphor, the real thing always wins out. And I don't see how a first century person could believe a metaphor over the real risen bodily resurrection,
All right, please understand the language again. You notice how you slip from metaphor to real. Please understand, I'm saying the most real thing in the world is a metaphor. I never use this language that you use, metaphor. Because let me take your question. A good first century debate. Paul is talking to an open-minded person who hasn't any of the hang-ups that I might have after the Enlightenment. He's telling them about Jesus, as literal as you want. Jesus is with God. You might say the God. A good open-minded Roman would say, but Augustus is already among the gods, and he is taking care of the Roman Empire. Why do we need another one? There's only one empire, or one world, they would say. Paul would say, this is how it works. What is Augustus doing for you? If he's talking to a high aristocrat in the Senate, he's not talking to him because he's not listening to him. The peasant, if you will, or the poor artisan, more likely in the herbs, is going to say, I guess he's keeping peace around, he's keeping the Celts out of the streets, and that's good. But he hasn't done much for me. I'm still working as hard as I've ever worked. So tell me about your guy. He's up in heaven, right? So he's influential. Tell me what he might do for me. That is a first century question. A first century response is not, I don't believe people go up to heaven. I don't believe in the resurrection. No, that's all us. First century is, what's he going to do for us? That's where Paul would say, fine. And in fact, Justin Martyr almost says the same thing when he says, well, you guys claim that your emperors go up to heaven too. But he's going to say, and this is going to get Paul killed and get Justin a martyr eventually, our Jesus's, all your emperors rolled up in a ball are not worth our Jesus's little finger. Because if you push him, what you people do is injustice and violence, and you run the world like that, and you think victory is going to give you the world. And our Jesus, coming from a different tradition, the Jewish tradition, says victory is a bankrupt program, only justice can rule the world. These are absolute clashes. They're not on the same level. But you have to choose, and what makes you choose is faith. Roman faith goes with Caesar. Christian faith goes with Jesus. They're both acts of faith, and they're both making an act of faith in a metaphor.
One final question.
Dr. Licona, you've talked about the reliability of narrative material in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I want to ask about Q, the name given to the body of sayings of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. Could you say something about what material from Q you think can be said to be likely, maybe very likely, to have come from the lips of Jesus?
What Q material could very likely come from the lips of Jesus? Oh boy, I don't know. I'd have you caught me on the spot for that. You know, I do think I do embrace the two source hypothesis. I do think that there is a Q source. I don't know what it is. I think it is sayings material. I think it's likely, or at least possible, that it's what Papias was talking about, the sayings or oracles of the Lord, that was originally in Aramaic, and that is what he attributed to Matthew. That later got translated into Greek.
The Beatitudes, Mike, would be in Q. The Beatitudes.
Oh, yeah, the Beatitudes. Thanks, Dominic. Beatitudes, I would say that. And even though we don't have those outside of the Q material preached in a sermon by Jesus, per se, on the Mount, we do have a lot of those same, the material in the Sermon on the Mount that's peppered throughout the Gospels, and we find it in James. We find some in Romans. So these are common teachings that were attributed to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, even just more than the Beatitudes, but the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of the material in that, I would say. But I have to think through some of that. Probably some of the things where he is talking about, I think in Q3 and Q13, where he's talking about himself being the eschatological judge. I mean, most things that historians of Jesus will agree on is that Jesus did claim to be the apocalyptic Son of Man. And so those Q sayings, I forgot what 3 is. 13, I think, is many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not do? And, you know, I forgot what 3 is, but those are probably authentic recollections of sayings of Jesus.
Before I let you all go, I want to remind you that as you're leaving, we're going to be having book sales and book signings by our two speakers tonight. But please join me in thanking both of them, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. That was fun.